So let me just start. Frank Gaffney will join us shortly. He's currently having some technical difficulties, but he will join us fairly soon, and will take over. But let me start with first a briefing of what is happening on the ground. So the crisis on the ground, the Israeli government, after 30, 40 years of a substantial judicial revolution, essentially, in Israel, that was started by Chief Justice Aharon Barak in the early 80s, late 70s, came to a culmination in recent times with such a power now invested in the Supreme Court, the court structure, and the legal structures of the State of Israel, all of which essentially now are subordinate to the court's will, that there was a fundamental breakdown in separation of powers. The Supreme Court, for example, 2 years ago, intervened in the proceedings of the parliament, the Knesset, where the speaker was operating according to the rules of the House, the rules that had been set since the beginning of the State of Israel, about how one names a new Speaker of the House. And the Supreme Court intervened in that and dictated the rules that the parliament should be operating under, internal rules that the parliament should be operating under to the parliament, violating what is a very sacred separation in the Supreme Court's role from the legislative branch. The second area where this has really taken grip was in the intrusion of the judicial branch and takeover, essentially, of the executive branch, as well as the legislative branch, through the issue of legal advisors. Like the United States, like many countries, the executive branch, as well as the Parliament of Israel, the Knesset, has internal legal advisors. Those legal advisors answer, or should theoretically be answering, to the branch they're in. So a legal advisor in the executive branch is part of the executive branch, should be answering to the executive branch. The legal advisor in the parliament should be part of the parliament and should be advising the parliament. But what happened was that the legal advisors of both the executive and the legislative branch asserted themselves as judges, not as advisors, who are beholden to the rule, quote, the rule of law, rather than to the government. Whatever rule of law in that context means is not quite clear. I think it's rule of the laws as interpreted by them or the Supreme Court. So essentially, they became an internal judiciary branch within the executive branch, within the legislative branch, and that their loyalty lay with the Supreme Court. So what you see in the last 30 years is a complete breakdown of separation of powers and the emergence of a super judiciary that stands above the government of Israel. And Israel is a parliament. Like any parliament, the parliament is the sovereign of the people. It is the collective expression of the individual rights of the people. Therefore, in most parliaments, in all functioning parliaments, it is seen to be above primus inter pares. Yes, there are equal branches, but they are primus inter pares. They're actually invested with more power than the other branches, simply because they represent the people. They are the voice of the people. So what you saw in Israel over the last 30 years was a fundamental collapse of those principles and an inversion of the system, where the government of Israel essentially now has become an advisory body to the judicial branch, which sees itself above it all. So that in a nutshell is where we were. So the Israeli government was elected after a campaign that very clearly was run in large part, not only, but in large part, on the issue of judicial reform, because huge elements of Israel's society had felt disenfranchised over the last 30, 40 years. They did not have any representation in the legal structure. The legal structure was becoming increasingly homogenous and ideologically tilted toward the left. it was a self-appointing structure, essentially. So every time the left was in power, they would appoint massive amounts of judges. When the right was in power, mathematically, the way it works in Israel with committees to appoint judges, it was impossible for the right to appoint their own judges. So essentially, what you've had is a homogenization of the judicial branch as well into a fairly radical leftist outlook that is anchored to the European Union and anchored to and quite loyal to the ideas behind the European Union and the NGO structures that the European Union is employing in Israel. So essentially, you saw huge political elements of Israel feel the courts were becoming hostile. The courts were not representing them. They were not consistently applying law. They were quite arbitrary on who would be arrested for a demonstration and who wouldn't. And it was always in one direction. So obviously, this became, first of all, an erosion of the credibility of the courts as a neutral structure. But more importantly, also, it left half or more of the Israeli population feeling completely disenfranchised. So given that their only way of expressing themselves was the vote, they voted. And they voted in November to elect a government that was committed to reform and made that a fairly significant part of its platform. In fact, in some cases, and among some individuals very high up in the party, it was the issue that they were running on. So this was not a stealth reform campaign by any means. The government launched that campaign. We could have a long discussion over how viable or credible that campaign was managed. I think it leaves a bit to be criticized, but nonetheless, it was a campaign to essentially address and repair some of the most egregious elements of distortion that had begun to emerge, not begun to emerge, had already started reaching quite a mature state in the last few years with the judiciary's essentially tyrannical grip on the political structure of Israel. And there was maybe one or two elements that might have pushed it hard, but essentially most of it was to reestablish the separation of powers and to reestablish the authority of the democratically elected branches of the Israeli government, the executive and legislative branch, and to begin to put the judiciary back in a more traditional, limited role, the way it's envisioned in the United States and in Europe. Unfortunately, this reform campaign ran up against a highly organized, massively funded effort in return, precisely because a small elite ran the judiciary, an ideologically encapsulated elite that had lost the public debate, had no real currency in the public anymore, couldn't win elections. So they retreated into these structures like the judiciary to continue to run Israeli society and to essentially make elections and elected governments irrelevant on some level. So obviously, the Israeli government, when it launched this reform, it instantly met with a very determined reaction by this small elite to try to reassert and maintain their power, or perhaps even expand it. The problem that emerged was that this campaign reached vast proportions through unbelievable funding levels for Israeli standards, frankly, very shockingly large funding standards even for the United States, which is a country that is it's about 50 times the size of Israel. About 50 times the size of Israel. So even for the American standards, this was a very serious campaign. And the Israeli government was caught off guard, was reeling, paralyzed, didn't know how to respond. And much criticism could be leveled at them for that. But nonetheless, the Israeli government was shocked. And finally, last Thursday, it started coming to a head when the desertions began. The very first desertions, regular army desertions, began in the Israeli military, and a larger amount of refusal to serve in the reserves was essentially snowballing. And the defense minister essentially said the operational capacity of the Israeli Defense Forces is damaged enough and is threatening to be damaged even more at such a critical juncture in Israel's foreign relations, namely that it's quite potentially at the eve of a horrible war, a war that many Israeli security elites are saying could be one of the worst since the 73 war in Israel. And essentially they used the operational capacity of the IDF, damaged it to hold it hostage to this political dispute, the opposition to reform. They deliberately began to hamper that, and they took essentially Israel's defense hostage.
And you're going to do the staff meeting down.
Essentially took Israel's defense hostage to their political agenda. On the basis of that, the defense minister backed off and said, listen, we can't afford this. We have to pause. The prime minister said, give me a few days. I got to figure out how to handle this. Yes, we've got to reach out. We've got to figure out how to negotiate this through with the opponents, et cetera, but give me a few days. And he traveled off to London on a critical meeting to coordinate on Iran with Britain. And while he was there, the defense minister, obviously under even more pressure, announced that he supports a pause of all the reform, abandoning the reform for the moment, which was a stab in the back to the prime minister. And the prime minister, partly out of political reasons, partly because this was a big problem now, and actually gave some legitimacy to using the IDF as an instrument in internal political disputes, fired or moved toward firing the defense minister. It hasn't been operationalized yet, though, so there's some debate as to whether it goes through. That then triggered a great deal of upheaval on Sunday, where people who were even for the reform felt this was getting out of control, and literally in a Solomonic way said, please, let's save the baby of Israel. We can't allow this to tear us apart when we're about to go to war with Iran and so forth. And even many who were for the reform said, let's just pause. And Prime Minister Netanyahu understood that. And on Monday, he gave a speech where he pulled the reform package and stopped it. And he explicitly cited the case of King Solomon and the baby and the two mothers who claimed the baby, and then said, I'll slice the baby in half. And the mother said, no, please just give it to the other person. Just keep the baby alive. He cited that. But I think that's a more broad feeling in the center of Israel's politics, that let's just save the baby. The reform isn't worth it. So that's where we came on Monday. What's interesting is since Monday, we have seen developments, first of all, in the protest, where while there is an element of the left who has now decided to negotiate with the prime minister and try to come up with a reform package sometime in the future that represents perhaps a broader base of support. But a good bit of the left continues and says, no, this isn't anymore about reform. This is now about getting rid of the government of Israel. This is about bringing it down through an extra parliamentary method. So the leader of the uprising, one of the leaders of the uprising on Sunday night said, we're not going to stop until the prime minister is brought down. A former prime minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, said, we're not going to stop until the prime minister is brought down. The lead paper of one of the leading papers of Israel, in an article by Barnea, had the glaring headline saying, Bibi Netanyahu, the prime minister, Bibi Netanyahu, a clear and present danger to the security of the state of Israel, which has obvious implications. And then all these organizations, some of which are funded by the United States, quickly proceeded to try to push the Supreme Court and the Attorney General's office, which you remember is now part of really loyal to the Supreme Court, to declare Netanyahu unfit for office mentally incapacitated or something like that. So the movement toward sort of escalating into now really an attempt to bring down the government through extra parliamentary means, which is a long way of saying essentially a coup, is now beginning to gain momentum. And most disturbingly was the Biden administration in the last 24 hours seems to have joined the side where he outright, where at first the ambassador to Israel said, well, there will be a meeting between the prime minister and President Biden soon. The prime minister, it's 3 months into this administration, and Prime Minister Netanyahu has not met yet with Joe Biden, a very unusual circumstance, and refuses to set a date. The ambassador said yesterday, sort of as a concession to Netanyahu, well, okay, there will be a meeting scheduled soon. And very quickly, the president, Joe Biden, gets out there and says, no, there's no meeting scheduled. There won't be a meeting scheduled. And then he attacked the prime minister, and he basically said, you're on a bad path. You need to get off that path. And what that path is, I'm not quite sure, but it's pretty clear that he's telling the Israelis, you can't halt the reform and then pick it up in a negotiation with the moderate left. You need to abandon it in its entirety. You need essentially to surrender here. And the or else is on the table now. Chekhov's gun is now on the table, where American-Israeli relations are threatened profoundly if Bibi doesn't give in. To conclude, finally, the thing that most bothers me about this whole episode is this is no longer about reform. This is now about a structure that whenever the left or the United States under Joe Biden wants to put such immense pressure on the state of Israel that they do not act, whether it's reform, settlements, attacking Iran, anything this administration doesn't want, anything the radical left in Israel doesn't want, they have now a machine, a mechanism in place to create such disarray in Israel that Israel is in effect paralyzed. And that is one of the things that most disturbs me. So I think I've gone on a bit too much. Carolyn is with us here. Frank, do you want to take over for a second? And
well, let's see if I can do so. We're in a workaround situation. I don't know if this sounds okay and looks okay. If it does, I'll be happy to take the baton. So far, so good. David Wormser, thank you very much. As always, your expertise in these matters from the American perspective is very, very important to our understanding of the complexities of what's happening and at whose hands. To get an Israeli perspective, I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to talk once again with Carolyn Glick, a senior fellow of our Center for Security Policy, and an extremely accomplished public intellectual, originally from, of course, the United States, but now at home in her adopted country of Israel, where she made Aliyah a number of years ago. She served in the Israel Defense Forces. She has been an advisor to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu some time ago. She is a commentator, has her own podcast, The Carolyn Glick Show, and I think you can find and follow her at carolynglick.com. We certainly do. Carolyn, thank you for joining us. Your thoughts on both what David has said and your own assessment of the situation from, again, the Israeli perspective would be tremendously appreciated. Over to you, Ben. Well, David, let me put a question to you while Carolyn tries to sort this out. The Biden administration has now been rather public about its direct engagement in Israel in this matter, even before this public toing and froing about whether there's a meeting and if so, when and all that. Apparently, the White House was saying they made numerous calls into Benjamin Netanyahu to change course in the run-up to his suspension announcements. Presumably, they were making many more calls to the opposition and others who have been trying to, well, as you say, not just get the judicial reforms thrown over the side, but to get Netanyahu and his government over the side as well. As a man who has served in senior positions throughout the United States government, have you ever seen anything quite like this, at least with an allied, friendly, democratic nation?
No, I mean, look, it's amazing that the United States has finally adopted a regime change strategy for a regime that tortures its people and so forth. The problem is it's not Iran, it's Israel, which is a democracy and has freedom and full human rights. On the democracy register of any organization's measure, it is way up there in the top 5 or 10. More than most European countries and frequently even more than we are here in the United States at this point. So this is not a repressive regime. I think what really bothers me is, yes, it is rich for the United States right now.
Hello.
There's Carolyn. So
got you. Finish your thought. We'll go to Carolyn.
Yeah, no, I just what really disturbs me is the line that went on. The idea that this judicial reform is some sort of a dictatorial 1930s type internal parliamentary majoritarian coup, which isn't even reading history correctly, but a majoritarian coup by Nazis against the government, by fascists, is simply wrong. There's nothing undemocratic in any of their form. There's one clause which I think is a little problematic, but let's be real. This was a fairly mainstream within the lane adjustment of what was really an undemocratic situation. It does reestablish separation of powers. And there was a lot of deliberate misrepresentation that was involved here. And the United States is fully participant in that disinformation and distortion of the debate in Israel, which is inappropriate. It's an interference in a foreign government's internal affairs, especially a democracy.
Especially to wrap it up in this idea that it is defending democracy as it does so. So Carolyn, back to you, and thank you. I'm sorry for you having technical difficulties. It's contagious, I'm afraid. Go ahead.
Well, I'm always happy to join you for the Center for Security Policy's very important webinar series. I can't add to what David did, a fantastic summary of the illegal knots that Israel has twisted itself into, or our legal oligarchy has. I mean, I think for me, the way that I look at it is just that, right now we have an oligarchy of unelected lawyers that exerts dictatorial power over Israeli society. This is part of a revolution that I think David has rightly referred to, not as a judicial revolution, but as a regime change that our own Barak enacted in Israel in the 1980s and the 1990s, when everybody else's heads were turned. And people simply didn't realize that. And over time, it became less and less sufferable for the majority of Israelis because it became more and more radical. So that, initially, people didn't really understand the implications. And then what would you call it? The arrogation of power by the Supreme Court, and then through them, the Attorney General, away from the Knesset and away from the government, it became greater and greater. So initially, there were certain minorities in Israel that always get bad press, like the Israelis who live in Judea and Samaria and in the past in Gaza, who were not afforded the protections of the court for their property rights and their human rights. And you had Palestinian terrorists getting extraordinary rights that are given to no one in similar legal situation that they receive on the part of the court. You had issues that jurists who engage in international laws of war were stunned by when Barak applied the Fourth Geneva Convention to Israel, even though by no legal standard are Judea and Samaria or Gaza under belligerent occupation under the laws of war. But these were all things that were rather esoteric and that touched on demographic groups in Israeli society that were considered beyond the mainstream, or they were intellectual issues that the vast majority of Israelis, like most normal people, simply can't absorb because it's too arcane, it's too intellectual, it's too academic for most people. So, these were the initial things, which is why, somebody like myself who works on these issues a lot, I started speaking out against the court over 20 years ago, and this was at a time when the court was second only to the army in terms of its widespread support among the public, its credibility among the general public in polls. So now they're one of the least respected, and in some opinion polls, I mean, they have about 20% of the support of the overall public, 40% depending, but they never come close to 50% anymore of people who feel that they're doing a good job or that they're credible or that they're fair. The Attorney General's polling is even worse. So Israelis increasingly do not have faith in the legal system. And it's not only, by the way, because of the way that the court has operated. And so it's expanded its power over time. So then they went after the ultra-Orthodox, the Ashkenazim, the Sfaradim. They started criminalizing Aryeh Deri, who is the head of the Shas party, which is a party of Mizrahi Sephardic Jews from Arab countries. And so they began criminalizing him already in the 1990s on charges that no Ashkenazi politician from the old guard socialist camp would ever have even been investigated for, and they sent him to prison. So, that was another group of Israelis who began getting feeling that they were being persecuted by our legal system. And then, more recent years, they've been siding with illegal aliens from Sudan and Eritrea against working class Israelis who live in working class neighborhoods in southern Tel Aviv. And they've been giving them extraordinary rights and not protecting the human rights or the right to life of Israelis who live in these areas. I mean, much like you see in the United States with federal agencies protecting illegal aliens across the Mexican border and not giving proper protections to Americans from crime that they commit. So there's a similar thing. And so it seems like with each passing year, another minority group in Israel finds itself persecuted by the court. And so the court presents itself as this protector of the underdog of the minorities. But actually, it's the only minority that it's protecting is the left and Israel's enemies, the Palestinians. By constraining the army, by constraining the government's power to protect the country and its national interests and its citizens. So they do protect minorities, but they're the privileged minorities in Israel. They're the banks, who, it was incredible. A lot of people pulled their money out of bank discount because the executive chairman of Bank Discount started calling for people to boycott Israeli economy, which is just stunning. I mean, it's one thing if you want to say something stupid like that as a private citizen and put your life savings in Silicon Valley Bank, like a lot of these brain dead high-tech people did. But it's quite another thing when you're the CEO of one of Israel's major banks and you're essentially encouraging Israelis to destabilize the economy. That's already something, that's a completely different kettle of fish. I mean, you have a fiduciary duty to your clients, and he absolutely broke it. So, you have people who are protected by the court, sectors of Israeli society largely the very wealthy sectors of Israeli society that are also minorities. They're just privileged, and I mean, inherently. I on my show many months ago, but I always remember it. I interviewed my colleague Amnon Lord, who grew up on the left in kibbutz in Israel, and over time during the fake peace process that we had with the Palestinians in the 1990s, he came to realize that this was just a crock, and he became one of the most outspoken writers on the Israeli right. And so I had him on the show, and he said to me, well, the thing about the Israeli left that makes it very unique is that it's not at all apologetic. Like our ruling class in America, the ruling class pretends, that they're in for the common man. The fact that Democrats, abandoned labor union politics with the advent of the new left in the 1960s and 70s is neither here nor there. They pretend that they're there for the little guy. In Israel, not so much. Our left is much less interested in presenting itself as a champion of the little guy. They lost the working class in Israel in the 1970s when they moved to the Likud already in 1974, and unalterably and without ever returning in 1977 when Begin was first elected premier. But they're very, what they aspire to, as David said, is to really live in a more European Union type of society. And so this past week, I had a very interesting conversation with French journalist Michel Gerfinkel about the riots in France, which I thought was relevant for Israeli audiences. And what Michel explained was that at their heart, the French who are rioting in the streets are a reflection of this sense of disenfranchisement by the French, that people, their vote means less and less because of the European Union, which has seized the powers to legislate and the powers to dictate the way that life is led in France from the French Parliament and even from the president. And so there's a sense that people that their voices mean less and less, that their votes mean less and less, and that their government is less and less capable of advancing the things that they need for their government to advance. And so I think that we are in a crisis of representative democracies throughout the Western world. You see it very clearly among Democrats after Trump was elected, and they restyled themselves as resistance. It did not recognize the legitimacy of his presidency. It's the same thing that the left does here. Every time that a right-wing government comes in, but particularly it's become more and more extreme over the past several years. And you see echoes of this as well, resonating actually quite strongly in Europe, in Britain after, over the Brexit vote, referendum, and since, and here. So there is something very common about it, but it's also that, we are dealing with life and death issues, and that's one of the themes that David alluded to that I think I'll just pick up a little bit. I mean, I think that Netanyahu probably, I have to say that our guys' handling of this entire episode was very amateurish. I mean, my colleague Ariel Segal in Channel 14 here, he likened it to, staging the Normandy invasion with, the Keystone Cops. I mean, they did not put together an operational plan. They didn't line up. They didn't have a strategy. They did not take time to assess the other side, its capabilities and its plans, even though, a lot of it was easily accessible because they were making these statements very publicly and they were organizing themselves very publicly. I think we were blindsided by the way that they, for the first time, integrated IDF reservists and regular duty people in them. But we've had things like that in the past, particularly in the high-tech, elitist non-combatant units, and also among pilots who are sort of legendary for being very, very far to the left, and as sort of a closed circle of leftists, and it's very difficult for Sephardim and sons and daughters of the communities in Judea and Samaria to get through flight school. So I mean, we've seen that in the past, and perhaps if they had spent the kind of time preparing this that they should have, that they could have expected to, they might have thought about that as well and lined up their ducks more properly with the general staff before this began. At any rate, you know, so it was ill-conceived, ill-executed, the entire exercise. And at the same time, the past 2.5 months have been gobbled up by the left's effective coup against the right, that they've used all the institutions of the state to undermine and subvert the elected government of Israel. And in the meantime, you know, if you want to talk about the hostility of the Biden administration, so it's bubbling over now very conveniently on something very convenient for Biden, which is to attack Israel and to demonize the government. But the Biden administration was also horrible to the previous government, which was completely malleable, and you know would do almost anything that the Biden administration wanted it to do. And I'll just give you an example, which I think is very telling, which is that, you know, just 2 weeks, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, David, they forced Israel to sign a deal on a gas field that transferred sovereignty over Israel's gas field in the Eastern Mediterranean to Lebanon, which of course is controlled by Iran through its proxy Hezbollah. And I think it was Biden himself put out a statement, it was Biden, demanding, saying he expected that Yair Lapid would close the deal through the, what's his name, Amos Hochstein, the U.S. mediator, who is actually negotiating directly with known members of Hezbollah terrorist organization. And the agreement that they forced on Israel was an agreement that Israel got absolutely nothing. And in exchange for zero, literally zero, we gave parts of our territorial waters and our economic waters with a natural gas platform underneath it to Iran through Hezbollah. We turned Iran into an actor in the Eastern Mediterranean, right across the shores from Haifa. So, you know, this was the most destructive thing you can possibly imagine, and it was literally forced down the throat of the previous government, which was supposedly enjoying good relations with the Biden administration. So, I mean, this is an important story to bear in mind, because it shows that the intensity of the hostility of the Biden administration towards Israel and the intensity of the Biden administration's desire to cozy up with Iran, even to the degree that they're willing to work directly and enrich directly Hezbollah terrorist group in Lebanon, which, aside from, you know, which killed more Americans than any other terrorist organization other than Al-Qaeda. So I think that, you know, this is striking. This is an extremely hostile administration, and they like the previous government, not because, you know, they don't have a problem with Israel. They simply don't like Netanyahu because he and Obama didn't get along. He and Obama didn't get along because Obama was deeply hostile towards Israel, and it had nothing to do with personality. And so when we're looking at what's happening here now, you know, we needed to shelve the judicial reform and to stabilize what's happening in this country, because Israel is essentially alone now against Iran, that thanks to Biden is now either about to become or has become a nuclear threshold state.
Amen. Carolyn, you've complimented nicely what David said, as well as enriched considerably this conversation. We've got about 20 minutes before we have to take a stop. I just wanted to put a couple of questions to each of you, if I can, quickly, and hopefully get some quick answers to build out on what each of you has said. Carolyn, one of the things that I've been struck by, and I'd just like you to clarify this, you talked about the opinion polls, a popular sentiment about the judicial reform. It's my understanding that not only as reflected in the mandate given to Benjamin Netanyahu and his coalition, but also in polls that have been taken in the midst of this brouhaha, suggests that even substantial numbers of people on the left agree that there does need to be judicial reform. So this raises the question, if that's so, and there are people, as David said, at some level in the moderate left, willing to work with the prime minister, is this suspension truly a pause? Or do you anticipate that it represents effectively the end of this effort of judicial reform?
So it's interesting, actually, support for judicial reform among leftist voters increased 10% between February and March, which is a stunning data point to think about. You know, so just 2 points. One that you didn't ask me, and then I'll answer your question. The first point is that 2 days ago, Ehud Barak, who was really the ringleader behind the entire effort to overturn the government, gave a talk or an interview to Chatham House. And I didn't see the whole thing, but I saw an excerpt of it. And he explained that this was all organized ahead of time, and it was based on a blueprint that was laid out in a book written by 2 professors at Columbia University, that had studied how revolts, mass protest movements had succeeded over the previous 100 years up until 2006. And what they determined was that if you can get 8% of the population to support the revolt, then the government will buckle. And so I think, you know, part of the reason that they kept inflating the numbers of people who were participating in demonstration and whatnot, you know, you'd get 20,000, they'd say 350,000 people are standing on Kaplan Street in Tel Aviv protesting the government or whatever, is because they had this idea that you get to this critical mass, and with the amount of, I mean, and this was all very much a media operation. I mean, it was all incited by the media. So that, I mean, the media was a central node of the operation. They, like, as David said, they were calling last Friday, Yediot Achronot, the second largest tabloid in Israel. They were essentially, their main headline was calling for Netanyahu to be assassinated. So, you know, this is the kind of thing that we've been experiencing on a daily basis. Not I can't stomach this stuff. I don't watch it, but I mean, people who watch the liberal media in Israel, this is what they've been getting, and just in a loop. So that's one thing. And then the other thing about prospects for reform, I don't think so. I think that, you know, right now what's happening at the president's house is an exercise in group therapy. I mean, you can't have 20 politicians in a room and expect anything to come out except leaks. And so I think that that's what we're going to get. But I think that the idea here for Netanyahu is to get them off of our back so that we can focus on Iran. That's the sense that I get. All of his international travel to date to European capitals, he's been to Rome, Berlin, and London now, has been about Iran. And then finally, I'll just end with this, which is that I think that when you look at what Biden said this morning about he refuses to see Netanyahu. Of course, he'll see Lula and he'll see whatever. I mean, Senator Ted Cruz attacked him very forthrightly and properly about that. I think that part of the main reason that he doesn't want to meet with Netanyahu is because the United States wants Iran to advance past the nuclear threshold. I mean, General Mark Milley said it last week. He said that the United States opposes Iranian acquisition of a fieldable nuclear weapon, but as you know, Tony Blinken refers to it, if you put it in a box, that's fine. You know, if the box happens to be, you know, an armory filled with nuclear warheads, I guess they're cool with that. So Israel isn't, which means, you know, he doesn't want to meet with Bibi because he doesn't want to discuss what's happened and what they're enabling. And so I think that if I were advising Netanyahu about this, I would say stop trying to get a meeting with him.
Right. Especially paying any price to get a meeting, that's for sure.
Precisely.
And to pick up on Carolyn's point, David, you and I have talked on our television program about the dangers at this particular moment in time, not only to be having Israel undergoing the kind of ferment you both discussed, but specifically to have the military of Israel seemingly polarized, factionalized, made less ready than it urgently needs to be. And maybe I can get Carolyn's view on this too as a veteran of the IDF, but let's start with you, David. How serious do you think it is? First of all, in terms of the damage done to the current status of the IDF, and secondly, and in some ways more importantly, I suppose, the perceptions that there's a vulnerability here that can be exploited by, well, Iran or its proxy Hezbollah or Hamas or Palestinians of other stripes, perhaps.
Or exploited by the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really two parts. Operationally, I think it didn't go far enough for the IDF to have permanent damage in the next few months operationally. Pilots missed only maybe one cycle of training and only a few pilots, et cetera. So I think operationally, the IDF is still pretty much on track now that there's a pause and so forth. But in terms of damage in the long term about the role of the IDF, the integrity of the IDF, the apolitical nature of the IDF as the shield of the nation has been damaged. It has been damaged because you can see right now the right is out there, leadership of the right is out there, begging their own supporters not to do a counter protest in the IDF against the leftists. You had all the technicians who service and keep the planes flying in the Israeli Air Force put out a video saying, listen, you know, you guys from North Tel Aviv sit in your cafes, you come to the cockpit, you fly these planes. But don't forget, we're also a critical link in this. And if we go on strike, it also shuts down. You had Unit 0404, which is a infantry unit. You started seeing a lot of people put out there, you know, we're the second-class citizens. We're the ones who you basically dumped on. And we're the tip of the spear of the IDF. We are the combat forces. Mm-hmm. And the right's leadership is out there. Again, like Netanyahu gave this Solomon speech about the baby, you see the leadership of the right is essentially begging its own people, please stop it. Do not engage in this. The IDF is too precious. It's too dangerous to do this. Can it? But they have to do that because that is the real consequence of what the left did, is that, again, it's at least half the nation. I mean, Carolyn mentioned polls. There was a poll just yesterday, 58% of Israelis believe reform should go for significant reform should go forward, but with negotiations with the other side. And 18% said reform should go forward, but even if there are no negotiations. So 76% of Israelis want significant reform. This is a consensus in Israel.
Yeah.
And moreover, there's all these social factors with this IDF thing. It's true that historically and mythologically, the secular, kibbutz, left-wing Ashkenazi elites were filling the most elite combat units and really carrying the burden of the state. This is not true anymore. 78% of the casualties of the IDF in the last decade have come from the periphery. And if you understand Israel, the periphery is sort of the right. It's when the state was set up, the labor elite put all the populations they didn't care about on the periphery next to the Arab territories. So they would be the absorbers of terrorism and attacks and so forth, that they were sort of a strategic depth. So Israel's pattern of settlement internally is sort of a core Tel Aviv, and then on the outside, that shell. So when you hear periphery is 78% of the casualties, you're essentially saying that's Ashkenazi, that's religious nationalists, that's right-wingers, et cetera, et cetera. Similarly, the conscription rates into the elite units in North Tel Aviv are horrifically collapsed in the last decade. They are not serving in the combat units. So this whole idea that they carry the burden and all the rest are parasites, and if we go on strike, the country falls apart, is actually grounded on a myth. And the myth was about to be tested by the right was beginning to rise up and say, no, we're gonna shut down the IDF. And that is the real long-term danger of what's just happened.
Carolyn, quick thoughts on the IDF, but I also want to just ask you about the issue of that you sort of touched on again, the Democrats beyond Joe Biden as a party in the United States, having long been, as you know, both of you worked for Scoop Jackson back in the day, a fidelity to Israel, its importance in our own national security thinking and planning and policies, as well as, safeguarding Israel's security, was baked into the Democratic Party from at least Truman's time, when he recognized the state of Israel for decades. But have we reached a tipping point where it's not just showing up in polls that Democrats favor the Palestinians over Israelis, but this is now policy of Democratic politicians, both in the executive and in the legislative branch, that's exceedingly dangerous, it seems to me, for both the state of Israel and us.
So just to your first question, just to wrap up, David gave an absolutely spot on description of the damage that the IDF caused itself. And I just want to make 2 points. One is that the IDF general staff disgraced itself by and one of the main reasons that Netanyahu fired Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on Thursday is because he did not stand up to them. They did not decry this desertion. They did not decry these pilots. They tried to understand them. They tried to contain the damage. They tried to give them the opportunity to ventilate and get it all out. And this is absolutely confounding, and when and unfair, because in previous moments of great polarization in Israel, and the example that everybody brought up, because it's still a big open wound, the expulsion of Jews from their all Jewish communities in Gaza and 4 Jewish communities in northern Samaria in 2005. Anybody who even sneezed in the direction of not showing up or following orders was thrown into the slammer. And anybody who dreamed of blocking highways to stop traffic, to make people realize that that there was significant opposition to Sharon's policy, was thrown in the slammer, including 12 and 13-year-old children who were incarcerated for months without being indicted for anything. So we've had some real perversions of justice in this country on the part of the left, and then here are the left doing all of the things that they were throwing children on the right into jail for, and getting embraced by the Tel Aviv police commissioner. I mean, these are things that people just couldn't stomach. And when the IDF general staff didn't stand up to this, it wrecked their reputation. And so this is extraordinary damage. And then the last thing I'll say on just what happened here is that, everything is now right up and open. Nobody can ever unsee what we've seen over the past 2.5 months. So I think, over time, regardless of how this ends up panning out in this particular government and this particular term of office, I don't think that there's any question that the right wing is simply not going to suffer this situation any longer. The Supreme Court justices are now full-blown politicians in the eyes of everybody, including in the eyes of their supporters. Esther Hayut, the president of the Supreme Court, gave a primetime speech, which was just a political address, attacking and calling for everybody to, man the battlements and go to war for her. So
against
and her privilege.
Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah, so I think that's and against his voters, which is exactly what they did. So I think that's it. And then in terms of the Democrats, I think it's very clear, unfortunately, that unless something fundamental changes in the direction of American, not just politics, but society, that yes, Biden is going to be the last Democratic president that even pays lip service to supporting Israel and to the U.S.-Israel alliance, which is why I think if you look at the values questions that the Wall Street Journal asked on a very significant, although I understand somewhat controversial poll that they published earlier this week, that showed a collapse in American self-definition as patriots or value that they place on patriotism, value that they place on belief in God and religious observance. I think that you're seeing, the basis of the shared values of U.S. and Israel were those values, the Judeo-Christian values that brought us together, that made Americans admire Israel and Americans love themselves as the New Jerusalem and the almost promised land of America. And so, to the extent that Americans become anti-American, they also become anti-Israel. And of course, the Democrats are the ones who are abandoning their faith in their country and their belief in its exceptionalism. And so it's not surprising that they're the ones who are doing this. It means that, Israel has to change. Now at 75, we have to get our home in order, which was really what this judicial reform is all about. And we have to be able to develop strategic partnership with Israel, with America, and diminish, and to the extent possible, eliminate our strategic dependence on the United States and just be, a small ally of a great country. And I think that then when there'll be continued cooperation, and there'll be less of a vassal state status. And I think that that'll be for the betterment of both sides. I think everything that Israel does for its own defense protects the United States. And to the extent that people in America recognize that, they support us. And to the extent that they're not interested in securing America's national security interests, they oppose us, because it's just true that the stronger Israel is, the more protected U.S. interests in the Middle East are. So obviously Americans who continue to think that that's important will continue to support Israel, and Israel has to do everything that we can to foster that, and to do what we can on our part to remain good friends of America by being good friends of ourselves.
Very well said, Carolyn. We're at the end of our time. I hope that these briefings by our members of our Israel policy team and Middle East team at the Center for Security Policy bear witness to our strong commitment to the state of Israel and to the very important point Carolyn's just made, that this is out of self-interest as well as a sense of the importance of the Jewish nation and its place in a secure posture in the very dangerous neighborhood of the Middle East. We will be continuing these conversations as events impel us to try to bring to all of you, and hopefully those of you on the video at the moment, the Zoom call, will help us get the word out about this product to friends, family members, colleagues, and others in your circles of influence, because we all have a need to know what is actually happening there, at whose hands, and to what end, if we are to be making, I think, the kinds of decisions that will safeguard America's vital interests and national security, as well as be a good friend to an important ally in the state of Israel. Thank you to Carolyn Glick and to David Wormser for your expertise and these contributions. We'll look forward to a regrouping soon. And again, thanks to all of you for helping us get the word out as to what's at stake here and why it matters so much. God bless you all. We'll talk with you again in the near future. Till then, this is Frank Gaffney. Thanks so much for watching.